She pulled out her phone, pretending to make a call, her voice trembling as she spoke into the empty line. "Yeah, I'm almost home. Can you meet me outside?" she said, hoping the man would hear. The car stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the driver's door opened, and a tall figure stepped out, his movements deliberate, almost casual. He called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" His voice was friendly, but something about it made her skin crawl. Rachel shook her head, backing away. "No, I'm fine, thank you." The man took a step closer, his smile never reaching his eyes. "It's cold out. I can give you a lift." She could see now that he was holding something in his hand, a set of keys, maybe, or something else, glinting in the dim light. She turned and ran, her breath coming in sharp bursts, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't look back until she reached her apartment building, slamming the door behind her and locking it tight. Later that night, she heard the sound of a car idling outside her window. She peeked through the blinds and saw the same car, parked across the street, headlights off, engine running. It stayed there for nearly an hour before finally driving away. Rachel never saw the man again, but for weeks afterward, she felt his eyes on her every time she walked home. She changed her route, started carrying pepper spray, and never again took her safety for granted. Our second story comes from a man named Marcus, who grew up in a rural town where everyone knew everyone, or so he thought. One summer, when he was 16, Marcus and his friends decided to explore an abandoned farmhouse on the edge of town. The place had been empty for years, its windows boarded up, its yard overgrown with weeds. Local kids whispered that it was haunted, but Marcus didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in people, and sometimes, people are far scarier than any ghost story. They broke in through a loose board on the back porch, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of rot. They wandered from room to room, laughing nervously, daring each other to go upstairs. That's when they heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the basement. At first, they thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But as they listened, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Marcus's friend dared him to check it out. Heart pounding, he crept down the narrow basement stairs, his flashlight beam trembling. At the bottom, he saw a pile of old blankets in the corner and something, or someone, moving beneath them. He froze, unable to speak. The blankets shifted, and a pair of eyes stared back at him, wide and wild. It was a man, filthy and thin, his hair matted, his clothes ragged. He whispered, "Don't tell them I'm here." Marcus backed away slowly, his friends calling down from the top of the stairs. He didn't answer. He just kept moving, never taking his eyes off the man in the corner. When he finally reached the top, he slammed the door shut and told his friends to run. They didn't stop until they were back in town, breathless and shaken. The police later found evidence that the man had been living in the basement for months, surviving on scraps and rainwater. No one knew who he was or where he'd come from. Marcus never went back to the farmhouse, and to this day, he wonders what might have happened if he'd stayed just a moment longer. Our third story comes from a woman named Lila, who, at the time, was working as a night shift nurse in a mid-sized city hospital. The hospital was old, with long, echoing corridors and flickering fluorescent lights that never seemed to stay fully lit. Lila was used to the strange hours and the even stranger patients. But nothing had prepared her for the night she met the man in the green jacket. "Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I invite you to settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely, because what you're about to hear are not just stories, they're warnings. These are the true accounts of people who found themselves face to face with the unknown, the dangerous, and the unexplainable. These are the moments that changed lives, the encounters that left scars, and the stories that end with a single, desperate wish: let's not meet again." Our first story comes from a woman named Rachel, who, at the time, was just 19 and living in a small college town. She'd always considered herself street smart, the kind of person who double-checked her locks and kept her phone charged. But one night, as she walked home from a late shift at the campus library, she realized that sometimes no amount of preparation can protect you from the truly unpredictable. It was a cold November evening, the kind where your breath hangs in the air and every footstep echoes a little too loudly. Rachel's route home took her down a quiet residential street, lined with old maples and the occasional flickering porch light. She was halfway home when she noticed a car idling at the curb, headlights off, engine running. She didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone waiting for a friend, maybe a neighbor getting ready to leave. But as she passed, she felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She quickened her pace, her boots crunching on the frosty sidewalk. The car's engine revved, and she heard the tires roll slowly behind her. She glanced back, heart pounding, and saw a man in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, his face obscured by shadow. Rachel's mind raced. Was she overreacting? Was this just a coincidence? She turned down a side street, hoping to lose him, but the car followed, matching her every move. It was just after 2 a.m., the quietest part of the night, when Lila stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The hospital's smoking area was tucked away behind the building, shielded from the street by a row of overgrown hedges. She was alone, or so she thought, until she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind her. She turned, expecting to see a fellow nurse or maybe a security guard, but instead, she saw a man standing just at the edge of the light, his face hidden by the hood of a faded green jacket. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her. Lila felt a chill run down her spine. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer. He took a step closer, and she could see now that his hands were shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped something in his pocket. Lila's instincts screamed at her to go back inside, but she didn't want to show fear. "You're not supposed to be back here," she said, a little louder this time. The man finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "I need to see someone." "She's inside." Lila shook her head. "Visiting hours are over. You'll have to come back in the morning." The man's eyes flicked up, and for a moment, she saw something desperate in them. Fear, anger, maybe both. He took another step forward, and Lila backed away, her hand reaching for the door handle behind her. Suddenly, the door swung open, and one of the security guards stepped out, startled to see the two of them. The man in the green jacket turned and melted into the shadows, disappearing into the night. The guard asked if everything was okay, and Lila nodded, too shaken to explain. She never saw the man again, but for weeks afterward, she found herself glancing over her shoulder every time she stepped outside, haunted by the memory of those desperate eyes. Our fourth story comes from a man named Ethan, who, as a teenager, worked at a small-town movie theater. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and the biggest excitement was the Friday night double feature. Ethan usually worked the late shift, cleaning up after the last show and locking up the building. One night, as he was sweeping popcorn from the aisles, he noticed a man sitting alone in the back row, long after the credits had rolled. Ethan approached, thinking the man had fallen asleep. "Excuse me, sir, we're closing up now," he said. The man didn't move. Ethan stepped closer, and that's when he realized the man's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, unblinking. "Sir," Ethan repeated, his voice trembling. The man slowly turned his head, and Ethan saw that his face was expressionless, almost mask-like. Without a word, the man stood up and walked out of the theater, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Ethan watched him go, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. He finished his cleaning as quickly as he could, eager to leave. As he locked the front doors, he glanced outside and saw the man standing across the street, still staring at the theater. Ethan hurried to his car, locking the doors as soon as he got inside. For the next week, Ethan saw the man everywhere, at the grocery store, at the gas station, even outside his house late at night. The man never spoke, never approached, just watched. Ethan told his parents, who called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man was gone. Eventually, the sighting stopped, but Ethan never forgot the feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone, somewhere, was waiting for him to let his guard down. Our fifth story comes from a woman named Priya, who, as a college student, took a summer job as a camp counselor in the mountains. The camp was remote, surrounded by dense forest and miles from the nearest town. Priya loved the peace and quiet, the chance to disconnect from the world. But one night, as she walked back to her cabin after lights out, she realized just how alone she really was. The path to her cabin wound through the trees, lit only by the faint glow of her flashlight. She was halfway there when she heard footsteps behind her, soft at first, then growing louder. She turned, shining her light into the darkness, but saw nothing. She kept walking, her heart pounding, the footsteps matching her pace. She broke into a run, not daring to look back, and didn't stop until she reached her cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, she heard it, a slow, deliberate scratching at the wood, just below the handle. Priya backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The scratching stopped, and she heard footsteps retreating into the night. She didn't sleep at all, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife until dawn. The next morning, she found deep gouges in the wood, right where she'd heard the scratching. She reported it to the camp director, who dismissed it as a prank. But Priya knew better. She never walked alone at night again, and when the summer ended, she was more than ready to leave the mountains behind. Our sixth story comes from a man named Daniel, who, at the time, was living in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of a bustling city. Daniel worked late hours at a tech startup, often returning home well after midnight. The building was old, with creaky floors and thin walls, and most of his neighbors kept to themselves. Daniel liked the solitude, the anonymity of city life, until one night when he realized just how vulnerable that solitude could make him. It was a rainy Thursday, the kind of night where the city feels muffled and distant. Daniel stepped off the elevator and walked down the dimly lit hallway to his apartment. As he fumbled with his keys, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, echoing off the peeling wallpaper. He turned, expecting to see a neighbor, but the hallway was empty. He shrugged it off, blaming his imagination, and went inside. An hour later, as he was getting ready for bed, Daniel heard a soft tapping at his door. Not a knock, but a gentle, rhythmic tap, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. He froze, listening. The tapping continued, steady and insistent. He peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. He waited, heart pounding, until the tapping finally stopped. The next morning, Daniel found a note slipped under his door. It was a single sheet of paper, blank except for 3 words scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Let me in." Daniel reported it to the building manager, who promised to check the security cameras. But the footage showed nothing. No one in the hallway, no one near his door. For weeks, Daniel slept with a chair wedged under the doorknob, jumping at every sound. The tapping never returned, but the fear lingered, a constant reminder that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see. Our seventh story comes from a woman named Tessa, who, as a teenager, lived in a quiet suburb with her parents and younger brother. Their house backed up to a stretch of woods, a place where neighborhood kids played during the day but avoided after dark. Tessa loved the woods, the sense of adventure and freedom they offered, but one night, she discovered that not everything in the forest is friendly. It was late summer, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Emily didn't mind the dark. She'd walked this route 100 times before. But as she turned onto her street, she noticed a car parked at the corner, engine running, headlights off. She hesitated, her instincts prickling. The car was unfamiliar, a battered sedan with tinted windows. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was probably just someone waiting for a friend or a family member. But as she passed, the driver's window rolled down, and a man's voice called out, "Hey, do you need a ride?" Emily shook her head, quickening her pace. The man persisted, his tone growing more insistent. "Come on, it's late. I'll take you home." Emily's heart pounded as she hurried down the sidewalk, the car creeping along beside her. She could see the man's face now, middle-aged, unshaven, eyes darting nervously. She reached for her phone, pretending to make a call. "Yeah, I'm almost home. Can you meet me outside?" she said loudly, hoping the man would hear. The car sped up, turning the corner and disappearing into the night. Relieved, Emily slowed her pace, but as she reached her driveway, she saw the car again, parked across the street, engine idling. She ran inside, locking the door behind her, and peered through the curtains. The car sat there for what felt like an eternity before finally driving away. Emily reported the incident to the police, but the car was never found. For weeks afterward, she felt eyes on her every time she left the house, her sense of safety forever shaken. Our 10th and final story comes from a man named Chris, who, as a young adult, worked as a night janitor at a sprawling office complex on the edge of the city. The building was a maze of empty hallways and echoing stairwells, and Chris often found himself alone for hours at a time. He didn't mind the solitude. In fact, he enjoyed the peace and quiet. But one night, that quiet was shattered by a series of events that would haunt him for years. Tessa was sitting on the back porch, scrolling through her phone, when she heard a rustling in the trees. She looked up, expecting to see a deer or maybe a raccoon, but instead, she saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, its face hidden in shadow. Tessa's first instinct was to call out, to ask if the person was lost, but something about the way the figure stood, so still, so silent, made her hesitate. She watched as it slowly raised an arm and waved, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills down her spine. Tessa backed into the house, locking the door behind her. She told her parents, who searched the yard with flashlights but found nothing. For the next few nights, Tessa saw the figure again, always in the same spot, always watching. Sometimes it waved, sometimes it just stood there, motionless. The police were called, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. Eventually, the sighting stopped, but Tessa never felt safe in those woods again. She stopped going outside after dark, and even years later, she can't shake the memory of that silent, waving stranger. Our 8th story comes from a man named Jordan, who, as a college student, took a job delivering pizzas to help pay for tuition. The job was simple enough: drive, deliver, repeat. But one night, a routine delivery turned into a nightmare he'd never forget. It was a Friday night, and Jordan was sent to a house on the edge of town, past the last streetlights and into the darkness of the countryside. The house was old, its porch light flickering as he pulled up. He grabbed the pizza and walked to the door, knocking twice. The door creaked open, but no one stood on the other side. "Hello," Jordan called, peering into the dimly lit hallway. A voice from deeper inside the house called out, "Come in, the door's open." Jordan hesitated, every instinct telling him to turn around, but he stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The house was silent, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. He walked down the hallway, calling out again, but the only answer was the echo of his own voice. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hall, a man, tall and gaunt, his eyes sunken and wild. "You shouldn't be here," the man whispered, his voice trembling. Jordan backed away, heart racing, but the man didn't follow. Instead, he pointed to a door at the end of the hall. "Go. Now." Jordan didn't wait to be told twice. He bolted for the door, nearly tripping over his own feet, and didn't stop running until he was back in his car, the pizza forgotten on the porch. Later, Jordan learned that the house had been abandoned for years, the owner missing under mysterious circumstances. No one could explain who the man was or how he'd gotten inside. Jordan quit his job soon after, unable to shake the feeling that he'd narrowly escaped something truly terrible. Our 9th story comes from a woman named Emily, who, at the time, was living in a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. Emily had always felt safe in her community, where everyone knew each other and neighbors looked out for one another. But one evening, A simple walk home from a friend's house would shatter that sense of security forever. It was early autumn, the air crisp and the leaves crunching underfoot as Emily made her way down the familiar streets. She'd stayed later than planned, chatting and laughing with her friend, and now the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the town bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. It started with a simple task, taking out the trash from the basement storage room. Chris made his way down the narrow staircase, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As he reached the bottom, he heard footsteps echoing in the hallway behind him. He turned, expecting to see a coworker, but the hallway was empty. He shrugged it off, blaming the acoustics of the old building, and continued with his work. As he was tying up the last bag, he heard the footsteps again, closer this time. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural breathing. Chris's skin prickled with fear. He grabbed the trash bag and hurried back up the stairs, but as he reached the top, he saw a shadow move across the far wall, a tall, thin figure just out of sight. Chris locked himself in the janitor's closet, heart racing, and called his supervisor. When help arrived, they searched the building but found nothing. The security cameras showed no one entering or leaving the basement. Chris finished his shift, but the sense of unease lingered. For weeks, he heard footsteps following him, saw shadows flickering at the edge of his vision. He eventually quit the job, unable to shake the feeling that something or someone was still down there, waiting. But sometimes, the creepiest stories aren't the ones that happen in the dead of night or in abandoned buildings. Sometimes, they happen in broad daylight, in places we think are safe. Our next story comes from a woman named Mia, who, as a college student, took a part-time job at a local coffee shop. The shop was always busy, filled with the hum of conversation and the smell of fresh coffee. Mia loved the energy, the sense of community, but one afternoon, she realized that even the most familiar places can hide danger. It was a sunny Saturday, the shop packed with customers. Mia was working the register when a man walked in, his clothes rumpled, his eyes wild. He ordered a coffee, paid in cash, and took a seat by the window. At first, Mia thought nothing of it, just another customer. But as the afternoon wore on, she noticed the man was still there, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Every time she looked up, his eyes were on her, unblinking. He never touched his coffee, never spoke to anyone. When Mia's shift ended, she grabbed her bag and headed for the door, but the man stood up and followed her outside. She quickened her pace, weaving through the crowded sidewalk, but the man kept up, his footsteps echoing behind her. Mia ducked into a nearby bookstore, hoping to lose him in the aisles. She watched from behind a shelf as the man paced outside, scanning the crowd. After what felt like hours, he finally left. Mia reported the incident to her manager, who promised to keep an eye out. The man never returned, but Mia never felt truly safe at work again, always glancing over her shoulder, always wondering if he was still out there, waiting. Sometimes, the most unsettling encounters are the ones that seem almost ordinary at first, moments that start with a simple mistake, a chance meeting, or a fleeting glance. Our next story comes from a man named Alex, who, at the time, was living in a bustling city, working long hours at a downtown law firm. Alex was used to late nights and empty streets, but one evening, a routine walk home would turn into a memory he'd never be able to shake. It was just after midnight, and Alex was making his way through the city's financial district. The streets were mostly empty, the office towers looming above him, their windows dark. He liked the quiet, the way the city seemed to breathe differently at night. As he passed a row of shuttered shops, he noticed a man standing under a flickering streetlight, staring intently at a map. As you listen to these accounts, remember that each one is a real person's memory, a moment that left a mark, a lesson learned the hard way. Maybe you've had your own close call, a time when you felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up, when you knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. Maybe you've walked a little faster, locked your doors a little tighter, or changed your route home because of a feeling you couldn't explain. If you have, you're not alone. The world is full of stories like these, moments when ordinary people found themselves face to face with the unknown. Some escaped unharmed, others were changed forever. But all of them share one thing in common: the hope that, whatever was out there, they'll never have to meet it again. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you found these stories as chilling as I did, remember to stay safe, trust your instincts, and, above all, let's not meet. "Can I use your phone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My car broke down, and I need to call for help." Tyler hesitated, but something about her desperation convinced him. He handed her his phone, watching as she dialed a number and spoke in hushed tones. When she finished, she handed the phone back, thanking him profusely. As she turned to leave, Tyler noticed a man standing at the end of the driveway, half hidden by the shadows. The woman glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear. "Thank you," she whispered again, then hurried down the driveway, the man falling in step behind her. Tyler watched as they disappeared into the night, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. The next morning, Tyler found a note taped to his door. It read, "Thank you for helping me. You saved my life." He never saw the woman again, but he often wondered what would have happened if he'd turned her away, if he'd ignored that knock in the night. Our final story tonight comes from a woman named Hannah, who, at the time, was living in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of a mid-sized city. Hannah had always loved the peace of her street, the way the trees arched over the road, the sound of kids playing in the distance, the comfort of knowing her neighbors by name. But one evening, a simple act of kindness would lead to a night she'd never forget. It was late spring, and Hannah was returning home from the grocery store, her arms full of bags. As she struggled with her keys at the front door, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see a man standing on the sidewalk, dressed in a faded jacket and jeans, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He smiled, a little too wide, and offered to help her with her bags. Hannah hesitated, but the man seemed harmless enough, so she accepted. The man looked lost, his clothes rumpled, his hair unkempt. Alex hesitated, then approached, asking if the man needed help. The stranger looked up, his eyes wide and unfocused. "I'm trying to find the train station," he said, his voice trembling. Alex pointed him in the right direction, but the man didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Alex's face. "Are you sure you know the way?" he asked, his tone suddenly sharp. Alex nodded, feeling a prickle of unease. "It's just a few blocks that way," he said, backing away. The man smiled, but there was something off about it, something that made Alex's skin crawl. "Thanks," the man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I'll see you around." Alex hurried away, glancing over his shoulder. The man was still standing under the streetlight, watching him. For the next few days, Alex saw the man everywhere, on the subway, in the lobby of his building, even outside his office window. The man never approached, never spoke, just watched. Alex reported the sightings to building security, but they found nothing on the cameras. Eventually, the man disappeared, but Alex never forgot the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone had chosen him, for reasons he'd never understand. Our next story comes from a woman named Grace, who, as a teenager, spent her summers working at a lakeside resort. The resort was popular with families, a place where kids could run free and parents could relax by the water. Grace loved the job, the fresh air, the laughter, the sense of freedom. But one summer, she learned that even the safest places can hide secrets. It was a hot July afternoon, and Grace was cleaning cabins at the far end of the property. Most of the guests were at the lake, and the cabins were empty. As she worked, she noticed a man standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the last cabin. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He watched her for a moment, then disappeared into the trees. Grace shrugged it off, assuming he was a guest exploring the grounds. But as the afternoon wore on, she saw him again, this time, closer, standing between two cabins, his gaze fixed on her. She tried to ignore him, focusing on her work, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. When she finished, she hurried back to the main lodge, her heart pounding. That night, as she walked back to her own cabin, she heard footsteps behind her, crunching on the gravel path. She turned, but the path was empty. She quickened her pace, the footsteps matching her own. When she reached her cabin, she locked the door and peered out the window. In the moonlight, she saw the man standing at the edge of the woods, watching her. He raised a hand, as if in greeting, then melted into the shadows. Grace reported the man to the resort manager, who promised to look into it. The next day, the man was gone, and no one else had seen him. Grace finished out the summer, but she never walked the grounds alone again, always glancing over her shoulder, always listening for footsteps in the dark. Our next story comes from a man named Tyler, who, as a college student, rented a small house with 2 friends on the edge of campus. The house was old, with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was cheap and close to class. Tyler and his friends loved the independence, the late-night study sessions, the parties. But one night, a knock at the door would change everything. It was a Friday night, and the house was quiet. Tyler was alone, his roommates out for the evening. He was watching TV when he heard a knock at the front door, soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. He opened the door to find a young woman standing on the porch, her clothes dirty, her hair tangled. She looked terrified. He followed her inside, setting the bags on the kitchen counter. "Thank you," Hannah said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man lingered, glancing around the room. "Nice place you have here," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Hannah felt a prickle of unease. "I should get going," she said, edging toward the door. The man nodded, but didn't move. For a moment, the two stood in silence, the tension thick in the air. Finally, the man turned and left, closing the door behind him. Hannah locked the door, her hands shaking. She watched from the window as the man walked down the street, disappearing into the twilight. She tried to shake off the encounter, telling herself she was overreacting. But that night, as she was getting ready for bed, she heard a noise outside, soft, deliberate, like someone trying not to be heard. She peered through the blinds and saw the man standing in her yard, staring up at her window. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Hannah called the police, her voice trembling. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. For weeks afterward, Hannah saw him around the neighborhood, at the park, at the corner store, always watching, always just out of reach. She changed her routines, avoided walking alone, and installed new locks on her doors and windows. Eventually, the sightings stopped, but the fear remained, a constant shadow at the edge of her life. These stories are more than just warnings. They're reminders that danger can find us anywhere, at any time. Sometimes, it's a stranger in the night, a shadow in the woods, or a face in the crowd. Sometimes, it's the person who offers to help, the one who seems harmless until they're not. The world is full of moments that can change everything in an instant, and the people who share these stories do so not just to scare, but to remind us all to trust our instincts, to stay alert, and to never take our safety for granted.